Divisions in the ruling class, conflict within the U.S. elite from the Cold War to today. When Stanley Kubrick's film Spartacus was released in 1960, it caused a very big stir in American politics. The author of the novel on which the film was based was Howard Fast, who had written the novel as a card-carrying member of the Communist Party during the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. The screenplay for the film was written by another Communist Party member, Dalton Trumbo, who had served time in federal prison for contempt of Congress after refusing to give the names of other communists working in Hollywood when called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The film told the story of an ancient Roman slave revolt that was brutally crushed. The Catholic National Legion of Decency denounced the film as anti-Christian and communist propaganda. The John Birch Society, a newly formed organization of anti-communist right-wingers, organized protests against the film. However, President-elect John F. Kennedy went to see the film in Boston and told the press it was a, quote, fine picture. The content of the film itself is worth analyzing. The film depicts the slave revolt led by a gladiator named Spartacus against the Roman Republic in the year of 73 BC. The film depicts the Roman Republic collapsing into authoritarian military rule in the face of the uprising. Marcus Crassus, the villain, is portrayed as a homosexual who uses the context of the slave revolt in order to defeat his political rivals and become the military dictator. After the revolt is crushed, Spartacus's son and daughter are able to escape and gain freedom because one of the Roman senators facing suppression at the hands of Crassus arranges for them to be smuggled out of the city. The tragic final scene in the movie depicts Spartacus' wife standing before him where he is crucified outside of Rome along with other slave rebels. She holds up his infant son and informs him that his son will live as a free man, not a slave. The plot of the film, very closely based on the novel by Howard Fast, is an allegory for the rise of fascism, the Second World War, and the Popular Front. The threat of communism and revolution by the workers forced Western imperialist countries to collapse into fascism, just as Crassus destroys the Roman Republic and becomes the dictator in response to Spartacus' slave revolt. The rise of fascism opened the door for the Popular Front, an alliance between communists and the democratic, quote, bourgeoisie, just as Spartacus' wife and son were enabled to escape with the help of a senator who opposed Crassus. The most widely remembered scene in the film takes place after the slave revolt is defeated. The captured rebel slaves are asked to identify Spartacus, the leader of the uprising, so he can be singled out for crucifixion. Slave after slave stands up and says, "I'm Spartacus." This was an obvious reference to those who refused to name names before the House Un-American Activities Committee. The film Spartacus and the presidency of John F. Kennedy marked a turning point in U.S. politics. The fact that Hollywood produced such a film and circulated it all over the world just a few years after being purged of anyone with the slightest communist sympathies. And the fact that the U.S. president-elect would defend a film with communist creators amid widespread condemnation is very important and not accidental. Joel Whitney's book, Finks: How the CIA Tricked the World's Greatest Writers, describes how starting in the 1950s, the CIA worked very hard to manage art and culture in the United States. Whitney explained, One of the major studios even had a spy installed as a covert censor. The use of a censor who was merely doing his job to localize movies to international audiences would further disguise the security state's drive to eliminate ideas it saw as unhelpful or irresponsible. In the shadows, he used his cover for his covert mission as booster for the American way, rolling back anti Americanism, pointed critiques of U.S. foreign policy, and honest depictions of racism, of entrenched domestic racism. He was the perfect blurring of propaganda and art done subtly. Whitney explains that post World War II, the CIA cemented its control over Hollywood pretty quickly, writing, as early as 1953, the CIA was preventing films from winning major Hollywood awards. According to Whitney, the CIA had assets throughout every Hollywood movie studio and worked to make sure that films portrayed the United States as they liked and aided U.S. foreign policy goals. So, why would CIA-controlled Hollywood produce a film that seemed so sympathetic to communism? Spartacus was not a low-budget film. It was the major Christmas season release of a major studio. The project was assigned to Stanley Kubrick, a top director. The historical context must be understood. The film, distributed all over the world, sent a subtle message on a number of different levels. To Soviet artists and filmmakers who felt suppressed, it told that their message must line up with the Communist Party line. The film showed that America was a free and open country that even allowed explicitly communist movies to be created, while the Soviet Union would never allow an anti-communist or pro-capitalist film to be financed and screened within its borders. In addition to that, the film sent a message to Soviet leaders. Khrushchev, who had just given his secret speech condemning Stalin and was at the time condemning Mao Zedong and breaking relations with China, wanted to negotiate with the United States. The film sent a message that the John Birch Society and the military-industrial complex were that in addition to that, the film sent a message that despite the John Birch Society and the military-industrial complex, there was a, quote, democratic faction among America's elite who did not loathe communism in the same way. And just as Spartacus' son had escaped with the help of Roman senators, the Soviet Union might get some of its desires met by backing the, quote, democratic bourgeoisie grouped around Kennedy. However, this would mean aligning with them against the hard right-wing militarists and those who kept McCarthyism alive. Understanding the politics of Cold War America and how they have evolved into the crisis U.S. society is now facing is something few communists have done seriously. However, it is vitally important to understand the present moment and the hope for anti-imperialist activism in our time. Understanding that there are workers and capitalists and that their interests are contrary to each other is basic Marxism. But the weakness of the capitalist class has always been that it is divided. Even in the age of imperialism, the dominance of finance and the heavy involvement of the state in managing the rule of monopolistic corporations across the planet, divisions among the ruling class still exist. As far back as 1848, when Karl Marx composed the Communist Manifesto, it was understood that these divisions would be a decisive factor in any revolution. The Communist Manifesto says, quote, the bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, and later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. In the manifesto, Marx goes on to describe how, as a capitalist crisis intensifies these contradictions and pushes the working class toward seizing power, quote, finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes a violent character. A small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the whole historical movement as a whole. Trotskyites generally call for class independence and condemn the Popular Front as a betrayal. However, every time the working class has ever seized power, it has come to power on the basis of an alliance of different classes. Communist forces have generally built up their strengths through these alliances until they reach a point in which they are strong enough to become the new regime. With this understanding, divisions in the American ruling class become very important, especially in light of the current economic crisis. Since the end of the Second World War, there have been very solid disagreements among the U.S. ruling class, and a history of these disagreements and how they intensified is extremely important. Leftist politics in America have become confused and distorted due to these divisions. And the unique approach of the city building tendency requires an understanding of these divisions and where we sit today. 3 stages of McCarthyism. The period of extreme political repression and anti-communist hysteria in the United States at the opening of the Cold War, commonly called McCarthyism, can essentially be divided into 3 stages. Many leftists oversimplify the period, and in doing so, develop only a shallow understanding of what happened. 1. Crushing the Roosevelt coalition. Roosevelt died as the Second World War was ending, and he was replaced with a longtime political rival named Harry Truman. In his final term, Roosevelt was unable to have Henry Wallace, the socialist and former Secretary of Agriculture, continue as his vice president. Truman, a political figure from Missouri, who had once briefly been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, was Roosevelt's vice president in his final term and assumed office when he died. Truman dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and almost immediately, even before the war had ended, reoriented U.S. foreign policy to see the Soviet Union as the enemy. Winston Churchill gave his infamous Iron Curtain speech on March 5th, 1946, marking what many academics consider to be the formal beginning of the Cold War. The Communist Party had been an essential part of the Roosevelt coalition, and many figures within the Roosevelt administration had been sympathetic to the Soviet Union and friendly with Communist Party leaders. With the backing primarily of various Roman Catholic organizations and political figures within the urban political machines, the Democratic Party began purging the Roosevelt wing. The Catholic trade union associations began demanding that communists be banned from labor unions. The Kennedy family in Boston was very powerful and embraced investigations of Hollywood with the support of the National Legion of Decency. Henry Wallace ran for president in 1948 against Truman because the Democratic Party had become so hostile to the Soviet Union and the progressivism of Roosevelt. The Communist Party's national board was indicted and convicted in the Foley Square trial of 1948, charged with conspiracy to teach an ideology that would necessitate the overthrow of the American government. The Communist Party was forced to begin functioning as a semi-illegal organization, and the FBI was dispatched to oversee the complete crushing of the Communist Party. 2. Who lost China? In October of 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, and the anti-communist forces were forced to flee to the island of Taiwan. Republicans began highlighting the various sympathetic statements that the Roosevelt administration had made about, quote, agrarian reformers aligned with Mao Zedong. President Roosevelt, who was a wildly popular figure at the time of his death, was suddenly the subject of scrutiny for having, quote, given Eastern Europe to Stalin. Republicans began saying, who lost China? The China lobby, made up of exiled anti-communists based on Taiwan, became prominent speakers at Republican gatherings, telling a story not just of communist atrocities, but of betrayal by Roosevelt and Truman. The Peekskill riot took place in upstate New York on August 27, 1949. This was a concert fundraising for the Civil Rights Congress, featuring many Communist Party-aligned musicians and performers. It was met with a huge mobilization of right-wingers by local media, the Ku Klux Klan, and the American Legion, and many people were injured. The Korean War was launched in 1950. Thousands of Americans were drafted to fight against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and 36,734 Americans died in the war, along with 3 to 4 million Koreans. During the war, U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur threatened to drop atomic bombs on China if they sent forces to support the DPRK. MacArthur did this without the permission of President Truman. Truman responded by firing MacArthur, saying that only the president could make such a threat and that this was complete insubordination to the commander-in-chief. However, almost immediately after MacArthur was fired, a huge amount of support for him came from Republicans and from mainstream media. MacArthur returned to the United States from Korea after being fired to a hero's welcome. He gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, and the press thunderously condemned the Democratic Party as having been soft on communism and unfairly restraining the U.S. military. The rise of communism around the world had some within the U.S. ruling class openly considering collapsing the United States into some kind of full-on military rule or fascism. It was during this stage that Joe McCarthy actually emerged, riding the wave of anti-communism and allegations that against the Democrats to advance his personal career. In February of 1950, Joe McCarthy began holding up a piece of paper in his speeches, claiming that it was a list of, quote, card-carrying communists who worked in the U.S. State Department. The list was a complete fabrication. Many State Department employees had been Roosevelt supporters who sympathized with the USSR, and the entire U.S. State Department had embraced the Soviet Union as an ally against the Nazis. But the idea that there were, quote, card-carrying communists employed throughout the U.S. State Department was simply inaccurate. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican and military hero, was elected president in 1952, denouncing the Democrat Party as having been soft on communism. 3. Thaw in McCarthyism. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had been convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage for allegedly having given the atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union. While it appears they indeed had some contact with Soviet intelligence, the two former Communist Party members were not responsible for the Soviet Union developing nuclear weapons. The couple were sentenced to death in what looked like a threat to many within the U.S. government who had cooperated with the Soviet Union as part of the U.S.-Soviet alliance during the Second World War. While the Catholic Church was notoriously anti-communist, the Pope came forward and asked that the U.S. government grant clemency and not execute the couple. Many European governments also urged the United States not to proceed with the execution. The fact that the Rosenbergs were of Jewish heritage became a big part of media discourse around the case. The execution was originally set to take place on Friday night, just after sunset, a time in which many Jews observe the Sabbath. Ultimately, the time of execution was moved to several hours before sunset in order to avoid the anti-Semitic implications, and the Rosenbergs were executed on June 19th, 1953. New York City's Union Square on the night of the execution, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in New York City's Union Square on the night of the execution to express their opposition. Throughout Europe, many declared the executions of the Rosenbergs to be a proto-fascist political statement and a threat on the lives of Jewish Americans. While the USA had smashed the Communist Party, France, Belgium, Italy, Britain, and many US-aligned countries in Europe allowed the communists to openly operate, hold seats in parliament, and run labor unions. The execution of the Rosenbergs drew a wedge between the USA and Europe, as fascism and the Holocaust were a fresh memory, and U.S. anti-communist hysteria, often laced with underlying anti-Semitism, seemed very reminiscent of Nazi rhetoric. The Soviet Union had originally supported the creation of Israel in 1948. However, in the early 1950s, the various Marxist-Leninist governments of Eastern Europe began discovering networks of Israeli spies. Israel began denouncing the USSR as anti-Semitic. However, many conservatives at the time opposed aid to Israel, alleging that Israel had ties to communism, and the Israeli Communist Party openly operated as a pro-Soviet wing of Israeli politics. The Israeli Labor Party also had friendly ties to the Soviet Union. This caused many conservatives to view Israel with suspicion. Stalin died on March 5th, 1953, almost immediately, a power struggle began among Soviet leaders about who would take the lead after his death. Molotov was a political figure most associated with continuing Stalin's focus on anti-imperialism and strengthening the world communist movement, while another faction led by Nikita Khrushchev favored softening the global communist movement in the hopes of improving relations with the United States. Many among the U.S. intelligence apparatus hoped that the new leaders of the Soviet Union could be negotiated with. The USA was already friendly and providing aid to Yugoslavia after Tito had broken with the Soviet Union. However, Joe McCarthy began condemning the U.S. government for, quote, funding communist nations because of the aid provided to Yugoslavia. Radio host Fulton Lewis Jr. teamed up with McCarthy to target specific individuals for alleged communist ties, often with doctored photographs, exaggerated stories, guilt by association, and other smears. McCarthy did not just accuse people of being communists, but also of being homosexuals. McCarthy began investigating Voice of America, the U.S. government propaganda outlet, for allegedly spreading communist propaganda because in some of its broadcasts, it acknowledged true statements or arguments communists made in order to strengthen its effectiveness. Joe McCarthy claimed that the CIA was controlled by communists, and it appears he used information provided by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to make these allegations. McCarthy argued that funding was being provided to liberal activist groups and different organizations around the world that did not seem sufficiently anti-communist. This was true. Starting in 1951, the CIA had begun quietly funneling money to the anti-Stalinist left as part of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. The Rockefeller Foundations and the Ford Foundation were supplementing the CIA's efforts. As Whitney explains, the work of the American wing of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, quote, apart from its work coordinating magazines, a large percentage of the American Committee's day-to-day focus was spent writing proposals to would-be funders like the Ford Foundation, the Fund for the Republic, and the Asia Foundation. In June of 1954, U.S. Senator Lester Hunt of Wyoming committed suicide after Joe McCarthy began blackmailing him, threatening to reveal that his son had been arrested for engaging in homosexual behavior. After the motivations for Hunt's suicide became public, McCarthy was viewed in a very negative light. In 1954, CBS News host Edward R. Murrow aired a series of programs opposing Joe McCarthy. Hank Greenspun, publisher of the Las Vegas Sun, accused Joe McCarthy of being gay 2 years earlier. The information was based on claims that McCarthy had been seen at underground gay bars and that his lawyer, Roy Cohn, was gay. McCarthy had married his secretary the day after the allegations were leveled. The FBI later collected testimony from a U.S. serviceman saying that McCarthy had gotten him drunk and then raped him at a hotel. A number of allegations of non-consensual homosexual behavior on McCarthy's part were collected. Hank Greenspun, who first broke the story that McCarthy had homosexual tendencies, was not merely a newspaper tycoon, but also a Mossad agent. From 1947 until 1950, he had stolen millions of dollars worth of airplane parts, machine guns, and other equipment from U.S. military bases and supplied it to the Israeli military. For this massively illegal action, he received only a $10,000 fine and no prison time. He was later pardoned by John F. Kennedy. Amid the negative publicity, McCarthy's popularity began to sink. Congress censured him for spreading division and weakening the fight against communism. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower denounced McCarthy for his behavior, and he was stripped of his ability to work in congressional committees. He ultimately drank himself to death in 1957. McCarthyism had been fomented by the U.S. ruling class to crush anti-imperialist sentiments within the country, but it soon morphed into something that was a threat to many rich and powerful people. For this reason, McCarthy's reputation was destroyed, and the establishment mobilized to roll back the, quote, witch hunt atmosphere. After McCarthy's death in 1957, the John Birch Society was founded. The organization was based in Appleton, Wisconsin. The founding text of the John Birch Society is the Blue Book. The text is not simply an anti-communist diatribe, but much more than that. It quotes far-right European writer Oswald Spengler. It refers to a fight between Aristotle and Plato and contrasts the Greek concept of democracy as vulgar mob rule with the concept of the republic as a responsible elected government that respects the rights of the people. The text presents communism as modern-day Aristotelianism and democracy, i.e. vulgar mob rule, while the John Birch Society seeks to preserve the republic and constitutional freedoms. The founding document of the John Birch Society, the Blue Book, frames it this way, quote, from the compulsions of human behavior, which history makes clear, that the human race will throw off this tyranny just as surely as the Greek world, led by Athens, threw off a very similar tyranny imposed by fascist Sparta, or as the French people, in much more minute parallel, put an end to the reign of terror, which was the climax of the French Revolution. The question is when? How far and how long will the communist conspiracy keep moving forward successfully before it is overthrown and scattered to the winds of history? How deeply and irrevocably will we have been infected and ravaged by the disease of collectivism in the poisoned air of which communism thrives? How much of the free world can still be saved from the horror of communist seizures? Or, and this is entirely likely, gentlemen, even if the conspirators reach a precarious moment when they seem to have the whole world in their grip, how soon thereafter can the thin shell of terroristic power be blown by bits, and how much of our civilization can be saved from damage beyond repair? Books like None Dare Call It Conspiracy and None Dare Call It Treason were published in the early 60s, alleging that the US government was in cahoots with Moscow as part of a global communist plot. These books pointed specifically to the Rockefeller family, who had funded the Birth Control League, which eventually became Planned Parenthood, and the Council on Foreign Relations. The John Birch Society referred to Rockefeller Republicans and the Eastern establishment as their primary opponents within the conservative camp. As McCarthyism lost its strength, the wave of liberal organizations that emerged to fill the void left by the near crushing of the Communist Party was very well funded. The Ford Foundation, the various Rockefeller foundations, and the CIA itself were involved in setting up a kind of controlled opposition in the United States that pushed back against McCarthyism and recruited those who would otherwise become communists. The John Birch Society saw it all as a vast communist plot. Quote, the best way to explain the aim here is to simply quote the directive under which some of the very large American foundations have been secretly but visibly working for years. The directive is so to change the economic and political structure of the United States so it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia. These foundations, influential as they are, nevertheless, are comparatively just a very small part of the tremendous forces at work in America to accomplish this aim. And these total forces, marvelously organized and brilliantly directed, use 100 to 1,000 completely misguided Americans who are not communists for every actual communist who is pulling the strings behind the scenes to help them put over the innocent and even progressive sounding plans. An article on the CIA's website describes how the plan was to, quote, beat the communists at their own game, and how the Congress for Cultural Freedom had been inspired by a highly successful Waldorf Peace Conference in 1949. The CIA had seen that the Soviet Union was able to mobilize many of the most well-respected intellectuals and artists and scientists to support their efforts. It had begun working with Trotskyites like Sidney Hook and Irving Kristol to arrange and maneuver to neutralize intellectual and dissident circles. The article quotes Sidney Hook describing his plan. Give me $100 million and 1,000 dedicated people, and I will guarantee to generate such a wave of democratic unrest among the masses, yes, even among Stalin's own empire, that all of his problems for a long period of time will be internal. I can find the people. The CIA's efforts were done in complete coordination with the ultra-rich. The CIA funded modern art, promoting Jackson Pollock, and abstract art as an alternative to social and socialist realism. The Rockefellers' Museum of Modern Art became essential in pushing back against art that carried a socially conscious message. As the Vietnam War escalated, Riverside Church in Manhattan became the center of efforts to organize peace parades that pushed a pacifist message. The Institute for Policy Studies was established as a platform for academics to critique U.S. foreign policy and receive grant money for their research. The John Birch Society and the hard right wing seethed in anger at this, seeing the ultra-rich as being part of a communist conspiracy. Robert Welch, the leader of the John Birch Society, was himself a lower-level capitalist, the owner of a candy company. The National Association of Manufacturers, which had opposed Roosevelt, seeing him as a communist agent for his support for labor unions, now seethed at the Eastern establishment of ultra-rich bankers and oil monopolists that were funding a layer of left-wing activism. McGeorge Bundy, who served as Kennedy's national security advisor, became the director of the Ford Foundation and oversaw its funding of civil rights and peace activism. The United Auto Workers banned communists from membership during the McCarthy period, but it became the main financial backer of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights activism. The UAW worked with the CIA to establish the Solidarity Center, a foundation that coordinated anti-communist labor activism to work against the Soviet Union and Soviet-aligned communist unions. The UAW, pretty clearly an asset of American intelligence, laid down the funding for the creation of Students for a Democratic Society in 1962. The organization that soon sprung up all over America's college campuses was established by the UAW at the Retreat Center in Port Huron, Michigan. With UAW funding in terms of millions of dollars, the organization soon became the main vehicle for civil rights and anti-war activism on college campuses. SDS banned communists from joining for its first few years of its existence while receiving UAW funding. To communists, this looked like an effort to subvert their efforts, but many realized it was strategic to join liberal mobilizations to try and win recruits. The Communist Party worked hard to support the peace parades associated with Riverside Church in New York City. The Progressive Labor Party joined Students for a Democratic Society in big numbers and tried to push it to be pro-China and labor-oriented. The Revolutionary Action Movement and Black communist activists worked within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other civil rights groups. But beyond simply an effort to steal the communists' thunder, there was a bigger fight going on. The first academic voice to identify it was Carroll Quigley, a macro historian who taught at Georgetown University. In his books Tragedy and Hope and The Anglo-American Establishment, he argued that a faction of the ultra-wealthy was securing its grip on power and suppressing the lower levels of capital. By the 1964 election, the major political issue in the country was the financial struggle behind the scenes between the old wealth, civilized and cultured in its foundations, and the new wealth, virile and uninformed, arising from the flowing of profits of government-dependent corporations in the Southwest and West. Indeed, Dwight Eisenhower had warned about the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex when leaving office, as McCarthyism was fading and Cold War liberalism was in ascendancy. The government-dependent corporations were a layer of newly wealthy people who made money from the vast expansion of war production that marked the beginning of the Cold War. The John Birch Society, the White Citizens Council, and the many other far-right groups that deemed John F. Kennedy to be a communist traitor were very much funded by this layer. Carroll Quigley wrote, "The power of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in the frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent rewards in the business world. For the first time in its history, Western civilization is in the danger of being destroyed internally by a corrupt criminal ruling cabal, which is centered around the Rockefeller interests, which include elements from the Morgans, Brown, Rothschild, DuPont, Harriman, Kuhn-Loeb, and other groupings as well. This junta took control of political, financial, and cultural life in America in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Carroll Quigley also argued that the very structure of U.S. society was changing and that a new layer of lower middle-class people was being cultivated by the university system to become the enforcers of the ultra-rich and their struggle to contain lower-level capitalists who were the, quote, right wing. He explained, "There is a change underway, however. Our society used to be a ladder on which people generally climbed upward. More and more now, we are going to a planetary structure in which the great dominant lower middle class, the class that determines our prevailing values and organizational structures in education, government, and most of society, are providing recruits for other groups, sideways, up, and even down, although the movement downward is relatively small. As the workers become increasingly petty bourgeois as middle-class bureaucratic and organizational structures increasingly govern all aspects of our society is increasingly taking on the characteristics of the lower middle class, although the poverty culture is also growing. The working class is not growing. Increasingly, we are doing things with engineers sitting at consoles rather than with workers screwing nuts on wheels. Workers are a diminishing segment of society, contrary to Marx's prediction that the proletariat would grow and grow. I have argued elsewhere that many people today are frustrated because we are surrounded by organizational structures and artifacts. Only the petty bourgeoisie can find security and emotional satisfaction in an organizational structure, and only a middle-class person can find them in artifacts, things that men have made, such as houses, yachts, and swimming pools. But human beings who are growing up crave sensation and experiences. They want contact with other people, movement to movement, intimate contact. I've discovered, however, that the intimacy really isn't there. Young people want to touch each other, often in an almost ritual way. They sleep together, eat together, and have sex together. But I don't see the intimacy. There is a lot of action, of course, but not so much more than in the old days, I believe, because there is a great deal more talk than action. This group, the lower middle class, it seems to me, holds the key to the future. I think probably they will win out. If they do, they will resolutely defend our organizational structures and artifacts. They will cling to the automobile, for instance. They will not permit us to adopt more efficient methods of moving people around. They will defend the system very much as it is, if necessary. They will use all the force they can command. Eventually, they will stop dissent altogether, whether from the intellectuals, the religious, the poor, the people who run the foundations, the Ivy League colleges, and all the rest. The colleges are already becoming bureaucratized. I can see the big universities, the foundations, as a strong progressive force. The people who run Harvard and the Ford Foundation look more and more like lower middle class bureaucrats who pose no threat to the established order because they are prepared to do anything to defend the system. Carroll Quigley was a very important figure in U.S. academia, later cited by Bill Clinton as being his main intellectual influence and personal mentor. Quigley's thesis became popular in far-right and libertarian circles, as many of the main backers of the libertarian movement saw their enemy was not simply communists and Marxists, but a layer of very wealthy financiers and capitalists who put forward a left-leaning perspective. Carl Oglesby, a founder of Students for a Democratic Society, eventually composed a book called The Yankee and Cowboy War, explaining that the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the resignation of Richard Nixon in the context of a fight between the military-industrial complex and the lower-level capitalists against the ultra-rich Atlanticist monopolies. He wrote that the Yankees, in his narrative, included the souls most commonly able to accept losses and pull back, tended to argue from an Atlanticist, Council on Foreign Relations, and NATO-haunted kind of position. Further explaining his thesis, Oglesby wrote, "The Yankee is the Council on Foreign Relations, the Secret Round Table, Eleanor Roosevelt, Bundles for Britain, and at a certain point, the Dulles brothers and the doctrine of massive retaliation. Cowboy is Johnson, the rancher, and Nixon, the city slicker, Howard Hunt, and the Bay of Pigs team. Yankee is Kennedy, Cowboy is Connolly. The Yankee mind of a global scope is at home in the great world, used to be regarded as a whole thing integrated in the far-flung activities of Western exploration, conquest, and commerce. The Yankee believes the basis of a good world order is the health of alliances across the North Atlantic and the relations with Western democracies from which our tradition mainly flows. The cowboy mind has no room for the assumption that the American and European culture are continuous. It appears that among the rich in the United States, there are two different factions with two explicitly opposite aims. There is one faction that can be called the ultra-rich. This is the Anglo-American establishment Carroll Quigley wrote of, the Yankees in Oglesby's narrative. They are the old money oil banking elite with roots in New England who have dominated American politics and finance for generations. Their goal is stability. They seek to stay on top. As Ferdinand Lundberg explained in his book, The Rockefeller Syndrome, quote, "What is the fundamental orientation of the Rockefellers? They are certainly progressives, modernists, rationalists, children of the Enlightenment, anything but obscurantists, leaving aside economics and politics. But they are progressive strictly within the ambiance of a murky status quo, subject to most slow bit-by-bit change. They do believe in slow change because they believe change to be inevitable, but the emphasis is on slow. Whatever people find irksome about the status quo, the Rockefellers believe is fully amendable to reform eventually. The idea of Nelson Rockefeller being socialistic, as fevered in right-wing circles and as fevered right-wing critics have accused, is ridiculous. Patching up, shoring up, they all do believe in, unquestionably, but revamping or reconstructing is not in their mission. They will, though, adjust to any new current. In a nutshell, they are very much like the intelligent British conservatives, Tories, establishmentarians, and if they lived in England, they would unquestionably belong to the Conservative Party and the Anglican Church without being deeply hostile to the Labour Party. This faction of the ultra-rich operates through many layers of proxies and institutions designed to cultivate strategists and voices that line up with their goals. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Asia Society, and many different institutes and foundations hire academics to very carefully draw up plans and strategies for stabilizing the world, preventing unpredicted turbulence, and keeping the planet as it is, with them on top. The voices of the ultra-rich Eastern establishment and its drive for stability included the British Fabian Society and the various totalitarian fantasies of H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell. The World Economic Forum and its post-growth vision of a society where we live in pods and own nothing while being happy about it are the creations of the millions of dollars invested in studying how to maintain social control, even if it is somewhat expensive. This faction can rightly be called the managerial bourgeoisie. In opposition to the managerial ultra-rich, there are the lower levels of capital. The nouveau riche, the lower levels of capital, these are the military manufacturers, the small oil men, the first-generation billionaires. This layer is massive in the United States, a country that boasts of over 1 million millionaires. While there are many of them, their actual wealth is much smaller than the entrenched monopolies, and they are desperate to get more of it, to hold on to power, and to expand their enterprises. They favor deregulation, seeing that the laws are written by the entrenched elite. They despise labor unions as they cut directly into their profits. They want more military spending, lower taxes, and a pro-business atmosphere in Washington. They can be called the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. They simply want to make more money and demand the freedom to do so in an unregulated market. From the John Birch Society of the 1950s, right up to the Koch brothers and the fracking cowboys backing Trump today, this layer has always been pushing back against the entrenched financial dynasties. They love the Pentagon and military spending, as it provides them with lots of taxpayer-funded contracts. The networks of foundations, academic institutes, and paid liberal activists, traced back to the Carnegies, the DuPonts, and the Rockefellers and the Mellons, has sought to contain them and control them in order to make sure society remains stable and gradually roll back the influence of America's geopolitical rivals. There is a fundamental disagreement between the two factions that cannot be overcome: growth. The ultra-rich believe that growth is bad. Growth means instability. Growth means upheaval. Growth means potentially resetting a global order they are working to stabilize and maintain, a global order they sit at the top of. Meanwhile, the lower levels of capital are obsessed with growth. They want more money, higher profits, and an expansion of their enterprises. They see deregulation as the way to do it, and they want the ultra-rich and their stabilizing government out of the way so that they can enrich themselves. In 1968, it became clear that the fight between the American elite was reaching a kind of climax. The Vietnamese National Liberation Front humiliated the United States, delivering the crushing defeats of the Tet Offensive. Martin Luther King Jr., who'd begun advocating democratic socialism and loudly opposing the Vietnam War, was assassinated. His assassination was followed by massive rioting in every major urban center in the country. Presidential candidate Robert Kennedy was gunned down. Columbia University became the center of pitched battles as SDS and communist groups seized multiple campus buildings. The Democratic National Convention took place in Chicago, with massive fighting on the streets outside in opposition to the nomination of pro-Vietnam War candidate Hubert Humphrey. The Black Panther Party was growing in big numbers, holding armed parades and running a free breakfast program, urging Black people in America to align themselves with the global wave of Marxist-Leninist national liberation movements. To many in the ruling elite, it seemed that the Eastern establishment's efforts to push back against McCarthyism had gotten out of control. SDS had become a communist-dominated organization. The civil rights movement had matured into the pro-communist Black liberation movement. The U.S. armed forces were losing in Vietnam. The soldiers were refusing to fight. Richard Nixon was elected on a platform of speaking for the, quote, silent majority that was disgusted by the rising anti-war movement and the wave of urban rebellions among the Black working class. Nixon was always disturbed by many of the ultra-rich. Nixon was always distrusted by many of the ultra-rich because of his ties to the anti-establishment right wing. Vince Copeland wrote, Nelson Rockefeller was bitterly opposed to Nixon from within the Republican camp. He spent millions in a futile effort to wrest the nomination from Nixon, and not just because of his own famous ego and well-reported presidential ambitions. Nixon came into office as a right-wing strongman, an aspiring Bonapartist whose career was rooted in McCarthyism and red baiting. Many among the American elite were willing to stomach his populist rhetoric because they saw it as necessary to curb the rising unrest. Nixon's presidency involved a number of very dramatic reforms and maneuvers intended to stabilize the country and bring the political crisis to a conclusion. Nixon escalated the Vietnam War with massive bombing and then ended it. He oversaw amending the U.S. Constitution to lower the voting age to 18. He ended the draft. Under Nixon's presidency, abortion was legalized by the Supreme Court. The Occupational Safety Health Administration was created to ensure safety on the job. And Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce a wave of new laws regulating pollution. On April 22nd, 1970, the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth, as the rest of the planet celebrated with huge communist parades, the U.S. government held the first Earth Day with a huge open-air events promoting environmentalism in major cities, convened by Republicans and Democrats together. As a result of the late 1970s Church Committee, a congressional committee that investigated and revealed the illegal and secret activities of the FBI and CIA, we now know that the CIA's meddling in the minds of the U.S. public during this period, in coordination with the Eastern establishment and its apparatus of think tanks and academic institutes, was massive. Project MKUltra involved distributing hallucinogenic drugs, in addition to all kinds of other experiments with mind control. Carl Rogers, who became one of the most well-respected academic psychologists, began his career overseeing and facilitating CIA mind control experiments on non-consenting people. Intelligence-linked psychologist William Sargent in Britain was revealed to have done all kinds of massively illegal and sinister experiments in the 1960s, keeping people asleep for months. He published a book, The Mind Possessed, noting the power of hypnotic music, drugs, repeated phrases, and other methods of inducing people into a more suggestive state of mind. The popularization of various forms of Eastern mysticism was also a noted CIA project during this period, with a number of anti-communist religious sects being imported to the United States to recruit alienated youth. As explained by CIA Director John Foster Dulles, quote, "The religions of the East are deeply rooted and have many precious values. Their spiritual beliefs cannot be reconciled with communist atheism and materialism. That creates a common bond between us, and our task is to find it and develop it." Fidel Castro explained, both in the United States and in Europe, the big outdoor rock concerts were used to stop the increasing discontent of the population. According to recently released CIA documents, Allen Dulles purchased over 100 million doses of LSD, almost all of which flooded the streets of the United States during the late 60s. Thousands of graduate students served as guinea pigs. Soon they were synthesizing their own acid. The overwhelming majority of anti-war protesters went into Students for a Democratic Society on the basis of outrage at the developments in Vietnam. But once caught up in the environment defined by the Tavistock Institute's psychological warfare experiments, their sense of values and creative potential went up in a cloud of hashish smoke. During the administration of George W. Bush, a huge amount was written about neoconservatives. There are many conflicting narratives about who this group is and what it believes. Neoconservatism is traced back to the intellectual work of Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyite and follower of Max Shachtman, who eventually moved away from socialism, disgusted by his fellow GIs when drafted to fight in the Second World War. After the war, Kristol was tapped to run the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program. Kristol was disgusted by the New Left of the 1960s, considering them to be soft on communism and anti-Israel, and became a supporter of Richard Nixon. Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor who fled Nazi Germany and relocated to the United States. He taught at the University of Chicago and mentored many prominent individuals. Strauss's most widely circulated book is Persecution and the Art of Writing. The text argues that the work of great philosophers throughout history has been written in a coded way to protect the author from persecution. Strauss invokes Plato's concept of philosopher kings and argues that the enlightened few have always lived in fear of the bulk of humanity, the inferior rabble. In his mind, both fascism and communism are the results of average people not being controlled and their primitive impulses being allowed to come out and suppress the enlightened few. Kristol described how he learned from Strauss. Quote, "Encountering Strauss produced the kind of intellectual shock that is once in a lifetime experience. He turned one's intellectual universe upside down. What made him so controversial within academia was his disbelief in the enlightened doctrine of the truth will make men free. He was an intellectual aristocrat who thought the truth could make some minds free, but was convinced there was an inherent conflict between philosophic truth and political order. He was contemptuous of the modern demagogic idolatry of the common man." Both Strauss and Kristol worked with a layer of young, aspiring diplomats, politicians, and political strategists. Many of them Sovietologists, coming from a wing of US academia that trained them to speak Russian and obsessively study Marxism-Leninism for the purpose of defeating it. The neoconservatives had their roots in Nixon's presidency, but found him too much of a right-wing populist to be trustworthy. While the U.S. economy began to decline, Nixon removed free market economist Milton Friedman from the White House and declared, "We're all Keynesians now," accepting the notion that the state has some responsibility to manage the economy to some degree. Nixon enacted his Nixon shocks with a wage and price freeze and advocated for the creation of universal basic income. Nixon sought to incentivize American families to have children, contrary to what the Rockefellers and others were promoting about overpopulation. When Nixon was forced to resign after the Watergate scandal, the new administration of Gerald Ford marked the triumph of the neoconservative faction among Republicans. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney served in Ford's administration, as did Alan Greenspan. Students of Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss replaced the old right of Birchers and McCarthyists. Nixon visited Beijing and met with Mao Zedong and opened the door to establishing friendly relations with the People's Republic of China. Nixon's move was openly praised by David Rockefeller in the New York Times, but was largely the result of the geopolitical strategic thinking of Henry Kissinger. Kissinger advocated the U.S. aligning with China against the Soviet Union. Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, both of whom were financially supported by the Rockefeller family, became the dominant strategists of U.S. foreign policy during the 1970s. They formed the Trilateral Commission in 1973, which became an institution to reassess many aspects of U.S. foreign policy and its strategies. With the U.S. defeated in Vietnam and distrusted by Western European allies, Brzezinski and Kissinger worked to reorient U.S. foreign policy. The main way they did it was by having the U.S. appear to retreat on the global stage and then covertly manipulating different forces around the world against each other. When Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election, almost every person he appointed had worked on the Trilateral Commission, a Rockefeller-sponsored think tank run by Brzezinski and Kissinger. The Carter presidency served as a kind of truth and reconciliation for the 1960s, with draft dodgers being pardoned, the president convening a women's conference to embrace feminism, and the Congressional Church Committee revealing all the FBI and CIA had done to suppress dissidents and manipulate U.S. politics. Brzezinski and Kissinger worked for the Eastern establishment, oversaw the whole thing, and implemented their soft power strategy of reasserting U.S. dominance around the world. In the Carter years, the president was a friendly old man who appeared to be accommodating and soothing all who had been angry during the 1960s. Despite being a fundamentalist Baptist, he welcomed the first lesbian and gay delegation to the White House to discuss their concerns. Carter boasted of being a peace president who never went to war. Carter cut military spending and negotiated the SALT Treaty with the Soviet Union. Carter urged Americans to wear a sweater instead of turning up the heat amid the fuel shortages and rising costs of energy caused by the OPEC boycott. The White House published the Global 2000 report, arguing that humanity was doomed because of overpopulation and that every effort was needed to be made to reduce the birth rate as well as the amount of consumption. The document echoed the Limits to Growth, published by the Club of Rome a few years earlier, making similar claims. In Carter's infamous Crisis of Confidence speech, given amid an economic downturn, Carter told the public, "Owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of our lives, which have no confidence of purpose." While the tone of the White House was one of liberal enlightenment, gentleness, and consolation, behind the scenes, Brzezinski and Kissinger were working to spread chaos. Brzezinski bragged about how he engineered a situation where the Soviet Union would be forced to send its military to Afghanistan. In an interview with French publication Le Nouvel Observateur, Brzezinski admitted that the Afghan war had been entirely engineered by the United States. Quote, "The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter essentially, we now have the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war that was unsustainable for the regime, a conflict that brought about demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire." Kissinger pushed very hard for China and the USA to become friendly, as Chinese foreign policy shifted in an anti-Soviet direction. In 1978, China attacked Vietnam, accusing Vietnam of aggression against Cambodia. The U.S. maintained it was neutral in the fight between the two socialist countries, but Sam Marcy argued this was just hot air. Quote, the State Department pronouncement, which described as a policy statement endorsed by the White House, is a classic example of a cover story calculated to hide the real position of American finance capital in relation to socialist countries. Its strong self-righteous assertion follow the basic outlines of a well-planned policy laid out long ago, indeed decades ago, following the victory of the Chinese Revolution, the establishment of the People's Republic, and the emergence of a whole series of socialist countries into a virtual fraternal alliance of whole-growing socialist states. However, these latest pronouncements constitute a new phase in the overall worldwide ideological struggle between imperialism and socialist countries. The principal objective of U.S. policy is and has been to split the socialist alliance apart, poison relations among several members, instigate one against another, and bring the day ever closer of the military conflict among them. Shortly afterward, the U.S. and China formally established diplomatic relations. Henry Kissinger considered aligning the USA and China to be his greatest life achievement. In 1978, the Italian, French, and Spanish Communist parties denounced the Soviet Union. Brzezinski began calling them Euro-communists, and depriving the USSR of a huge network of supporters within the NATO bloc was a big game changer in the Cold War. The Islamic Revolution of Iran soon led to the Iraq-Iran War, with two anti-imperialist movements in the Middle East, Ba'athist Arab socialism and revolutionary Shia Islam, killing each other for nearly a decade. It is now proven that the United States armed and backed both sides in this war at different times, manipulating two large anti-imperialist movements in the Middle East against each other. While unrest and division were covertly being fomented among the rivals of the United States, the world was escalating toward more war. Kissinger and Brzezinski cultivated the image of being benevolent and coming to terms with racism and the ugly things in America's past. This was the strategy of the Eastern establishment, but it infuriated the military. Reduced military spending, the SALT Treaty, restricting nuclear weapons production, and economic policies aimed at creating a post-industrial United States caused the military-industrial complex to seethe with anger. Ronald Reagan emerged, capturing some of the McCarthyist and Nixon-esque anger at the Eastern establishment. Reagan said, "Let's make America great again," and emphasized peace through strength as opposed to soft power manipulations and the tender image cultivated by Brzezinski and Kissinger. The Iran hostage crisis created a moment for the military-industrial complex to castigate Carter as losing Iran and allowing America to be humiliated. Reagan emerged as a right-wing populist, but he was forced to compromise with the neoconservatives. And former CIA director and neocon George H.W. Bush, an old money Eastern establishment Rockefeller Republican from Connecticut, became his vice president. Shortly after taking office, Ronald Reagan was shot by John Hinckley, a mentally ill man whose family was economically tied to Bush via Texas oil contracts. Reagan's presidency pivoted in a much more neoconservative direction after the attempted assassination, with Bush having a huge amount of power over what the Reagan administration did. The years of 1978 to 1981 are filled with all kinds of intelligence intrigue and battles within the deep state. The faction that favored degrowth economics, a soft tone from the White House, and instability around the world was battling against the military-industrial complex that wanted healthy profits, direct military interventions, and an end to the, quote, weakness in American rhetoric and diplomacy. The faction that ultimately triumphed from the Reagan Revolution was the neoconservatives, despite Reagan's hard-right populist roots. The neocons wanted to spread freedom around the world with military interventions. They were unapologetically pro-Israel and saw the Camp David Accords as selling out Israel, and they wanted peace through strength. In their view, ordinary people shouldn't be presented with the nuances of world events, but instead should see things like a cowboy western. An article in The Nation explains Strauss's worldview. Intellectuals, he believed, would have to spread an ideology of good and evil, whether they believed it or not, so the American people could be mobilized against the enemies of freedom. For this reason, Strauss, we learn, one of the many telling asides, was a huge fan of the TV series Gunsmoke and its Manichaean depiction of good and evil. The neocons aligned themselves with a resurgent reinvention of Protestant Christianity. Jerry Falwell formed the Moral Majority, and mega churches began playing Christian rock music. Anti-abortion protests and a brand of television age revivalism created a layer of pro-military and pro-establishment conservatives. The liberal apparatus funded by the Rockefeller think tanks and foundation-funded activists was allowed to retreat to certain spaces where it could carry on a needed function as controlled opposition. Certain liberal ideas had slipped through and become part of the U.S. establishment. Blatant racism and bigotry were no longer acceptable, though innuendo and code words became part of the Southern strategy of Republicans, speaking of forced busing and welfare mothers to tap into white backlash against the 1960s upsurge. Women were considered to be equal to men, and many traditional attitudes about gender were eroded. Littering was considered a problem. Smoking was much more restricted, and environmentalism became standard. The late Cold War normal of U.S. politics cemented itself in the early years of the Reagan presidency. In this setup, the bulk of American politics involved a large layer of the country who believed that capitalism was the greatest system that had ever existed, Christianity was the one true religion, and that America was the greatest country in the world, spreading freedom by fighting dictators. The most ardent believers in this worldview were Republicans, especially evangelical Christians. The Democrats shared this overall perspective, but quibbled with how it was carried out. Of course, among the Black community, on the college campuses, among intellectuals, and in other layers of the country, such as immigrant and ethnic communities, these sentiments were rejected. But these strata were kept marginal in the discourse. Neoconservatism, with its my country right or wrong attitude, defined U.S. politics from the early 80s up to the financial crisis of 2008. Neoconservatives more or less ran the show, with the Eastern establishment and its strategists still having a lot of sway behind the scenes. The Yankee and Cowboy War had more or less reached a truce in the early 80s, with Ronald Reagan saying he did not resent congressional Democrats because we're all friends after 6 o'clock. Beneath the surface, a number of gradual changes were taking place during this period. The country was gradually becoming more and more ethnically diverse and less white, bit by bit. Living standards were overall gradually dropping, with good-paying industrial jobs being automated or outsourced, wages declining, and household debt rising. These changes were all very gradual and subtle, but their dramatic impact wouldn't really be understood until after the 2008 financial meltdown. Now, the next section is called The Case of Lynn Marcus. In light of recognizing the divisions in the ruling class that laid the basis for the political crisis of the late 60s, it's worth acknowledging one unique political life and work of one Marxist intellectual from the era, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche, first known in intellectual and activist circles by the pen name Lynn Marcus. LaRouche was from a Quaker family in New England, and he became a Marxist during the Second World War. As an avid reader with a deep interest in philosophy, the Communist Party atmosphere was likely off-putting to him, as it was to most intellectuals. Trotskyism, on the other hand, very much embraced bookish types and contrarian thinkers, and Lynn Marcus found himself in the Socialist Workers' Party during the 1950s. The articles published from Lynn Marcus during his time with the SWP reflect a serious interest in economics of Marxism and a belief in technological progress. A piece he wrote that was published in the Fourth International Magazine in 1955 opens by highlighting the relationship between military advancements and industrial technology. The development of automatic tracking and firing apparatus for anti-aircraft batteries during World War II introduced the germs of a new industrial revolution. The process thus portended is already underway. We have before us the technological possibility of freeing mankind from drudgery, providing mankind with incalculable material abundance, and giving humanity the leisure time to develop its full potentialities. We have at hand the beginnings of a self-operating means of production. The name given to this new industrial revolution is automation. The history of man's economic, social, and political development revolves around his invention and development of tools. It is by the implements of chipped and flaked stone that we identify Paleolithic man, the spear, the axe, the bow, the arrow raised man's food-gathering power above that of all other animals. The invention of the plow speeded the development of agricultural economy and social political forms which evolved from agrarian society. In each stage of man's social and political development, we look for the root of the changes in man's relationship to tools, changes in the means of production. Now, this is all standard Marxism, but forces were already in motion at the time, working to reinvent what leftism was. In the early 1960s, as the new left emerged, covertly funded by the CIA and the foundations of the ultra-rich, Lynn Marcus smelled something foul. He eventually left the Socialist Workers' Party with the revolutionary tendency led by Tim Woolforth and James Robertson. Even then, he was developing a worldview quite contrary to the direction that most leftists were moving in. According to Woolforth's memoir, The Prophet's Children, quote, I remember private discussions I had with LaRouche in 1965, where he went on at length about Kennedy, Rockefeller, and the Trilateral Commission. And LaRouche held to a view that there existed a network of foundations and agents of more moderate, internationalist-oriented Eastern capitalists who sought to avoid unrest at home through reform projects and to avoid revolution abroad through development programs like the Alliance for Progress. He was very much a believer in conspiracy theories. I, even in my ultra-left days, was a bit of a skeptic. For LaRouche, even as a radical, the liberals were the main enemy. Woolforth's memory must be a little off, as the Trilateral Commission was not established until 1973. But the overall assessment seems correct. LaRouche was seeing that the left, through various foundations and intelligence operations, was becoming foot soldiers of the New England old money elite and their struggle to suppress the lower levels of capital. And he, as a Marxist, wanted no part of it. Eventually, Lynn Marcus began teaching classes on Marxism at the Free University of New York, a nonprofit in Manhattan that allowed space for classes to be taught. The emphasis in Marcus' interpretation of Marxism was quite different from others who taught at the facility. He focused on technology and its impact on civilization, as well as his understanding of the basis of how value is created by human labor. During the Columbia Student Uprising in 1968, followers of Lynn Marcus formed the SDS Labor Committee as a group that aimed to link student protests with organized labor. When the mostly white teachers of New York City's Harlem went on strike against a black nationalist plan for community control of schools in May of 1968, the bulk of the left opposed them, viewing it as a hate strike against self-determination for the black community. LaRouche and the Labor Committee took the opposite view, pointing to black nationalists being funded by the Ford Foundation and arguing that community control was a method for breaking unions and implementing cuts in public education. This disagreement led to fistfights between the labor committees and various leftists from Workers' World Party, Progressive Labor Party, Communist Party USA, etc. Eventually, the Labor Committee, at the time a Trotskyite organization led by Lyndon LaRouche, took aim at the Communist Party, criticizing it for its relationship with an activist named Ed Schwartz, who had ties to the CIA and the Eastern establishment. According to a document the group published entitled The Conceptual History of the Labor Committees, quote, when CPUSA was not only continued this alliance in support of union-busting slave labor, but proposed to organize hooligan attacks on the NURWO, a LaRouche-led economic justice organization, members around the country, we broke the CP's campaign by sending delegations into public Communist Party meetings, demanding that this criminal behavior be openly discussed and voted on down by the body assembled. These interventions resulted in fistfights, and soon LaRouche's National Caucus of Labor Committees was battling the Communist Party across the East Coast in events called Operation Mop Up. The various Marxist factions, including Maoists and Trotskyites, lined up to protect the Communist Party and defend its meetings from the Labor Committee members armed with baseball bats, knives, and clubs. Much like the Revolutionary Union briefly became a pariah for supporting the anti-busing riots in Boston during roughly the same time period, 1972, 1974, the National Caucus of Labor Committees was viewed as an enemy for antagonizing and roughing it up with the party of Angela Davis and Gus Hall. LaRouche was labeled an anti-Semite and a fascist. Despite the fistfights, LaRouche, similar to Marcy, seemed to respect the Communist Party USA and on some level sought to recreate his own version of what it aspired to be. Writing in a document called Socialism or Fascism, LaRouche wrote, "The CPUSA is too easily written off by most leftist radical observers today. Despite the shattering effects of McCarthyism, the 20th Party Congress, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the CPUSA has the largest political capital of left radical on the scene at this stage. Furthermore, it has certain technical qualifications which will manifest themselves only when the masses of organized and unorganized working people in this country begin to move as a radicalized force. The CP is, in that sense, a sleeper at this instant." One can infer, based on these quotations, that LaRouche seemed to have targeted the CPUSA because he saw that, unlike most socialist and Marxist groups, which were merely academic or only launched symbolic protest, the Communist Party, because of its history and organizational structure, could play a much more serious and important role in a crisis. Thus, its collaboration with the Rockefellers and the CIA made it more dangerous. Regardless, LaRouche and his organization spent the 70s praising Ba'athist Arab socialism in the Middle East, condemning the role of Zionism in U.S. politics, and exposing the bulk of the socialist movement as being aligned with the more dangerous degrowth-oriented wing of the ruling class. LaRouche became very interested in fusion energy and saw opposition to nuclear power as coming from big oil monopolies and the Malthusian ultra-rich. LaRouche appeared to have mixed feelings on the USSR during these years, sometimes praising the Soviet Union and other times repeating U.S. talking points against it. As the turmoil of the late 70s with the Iran hostage crisis and economic fallout escalated, the LaRouche movement, then calling itself the U.S. Labor Party, pivoted in its role. LaRouche emphasized the need to fund scientific research and technological research and saw increasing military spending as a mechanism for doing so. He became an ardent defender of nuclear power. At a presidential forum, he was seated next to Ronald Reagan, despite being an obscure third-party candidate. Reagan spoke positively of him to the press. LaRouche members published Dope Incorporated in 1980, exposing the ties of U.S. intelligence apparatus and the British global financial system to the drug trade, hoping to capture the anti-drug sentiments that had been growing among the American working families who had been negatively impacted by 1960s cultural revolution and the glorification of narcotics. We now know that the CIA Project MKUltra had a huge amount to do with the rise of drug use across the country during these years. Around this time, he dropped Marxism, and his organization embraced American economics and put forward by Henry Charles Carrick and Friedrich List. The group celebrated Reagan as an industrialist and opposed George Herbert Walker Bush as an old money New England Republican. In the post-Marxist narrative of LaRouche, free market economics and the rule of the world by big bankers was the British system, whereas the idea of the United States, as put forward by figures like Alexander Hamilton, was fundamentally opposed. LaRouche's organization gained national prominence in 1984, winning the Democratic primaries in Chicago and airing paid TV broadcasts that were viewed by millions of people. Reagan embraced a project to move forward with military research into laser beam weapons, which the press called Star Wars and widely mocked, and quickly linked to LaRouche, who took credit for it. The LaRouche organization put together a national protest march, including many black ministers who had worked with Martin Luther King Jr., calling for scientific research and funding for the Pentagon. When George Herbert Walker Bush was elected in 1988, he proceeded to prosecute Lyndon LaRouche and his top organizational leaders on spurious financial charges. The leadership of the organization was railroaded to prison, and many assets were seized. Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General, represented LaRouche in his appeals from federal prison. LaRouche was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the Clinton administration arranged for an early parole for him in 1994. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it appeared LaRouche was gaining influence internationally. A faction of the Communist Party of Ukraine, led by Natila Vertrenko, broke away and became the Progressive Socialist Party and embraced LaRouche's teachings. LaRouche also gained significant influence in China among Communist Party leaders who took seriously his economic proposals and analysis. LaRouche literature began arguing that China, since the Deng era, had adopted American economics. The LaRouche movement pays particularly close attention to promoting classical music and celebrating trends in art and culture. The LaRouche movement sees itself as continuers of the Platonic tradition in opposition to Aristotle, and largely argues that history is created by ideas. The group has its own unique understanding of psychoanalysis. One of LaRouche's final books, Earth's Next 50 Years, published in 2004, has a chapter referring to the Eurasian future of human civilization. In the text, he made the following observations. Quote, under the changes unleashed beginning in the middle of the 1960s, the U.S. was put through a process of transformation from being the world's leading producer nation towards a transformation into an internally despoiled post-industrial utopia, sucking the blood of the world in a fashion recalling the reign of bread and circuses in the self-doomed ancient Rome. Since 1982, the USA economically has survived in large part by sucking the juices of the bodies of Central and South America as from others. This process, as in the notable examples of Mexico and Argentina, the profits enjoyed by the liberal predators have destroyed net levels of technology and productive powers of labor of the populations of these victim nations. The general effect of globalized outsourcing is the same generally. Eurasia is a reality. It is an emergent economic reality. We have before us the prospect of a Eurasian culture now emerging. The different approach is the common interest of mankind. Let us affirm the responsibility of government, individually and collectively, for the dignity of the human individual, as expressed by the right of that individual and that family to have their children and grandchildren the prospect of an improved condition of life, a worthwhile future, a recognition of their personal identity as a person who in their lifetime has been given the opportunity to contribute to humanity as a whole, to honor of the past and benefit the future. The planet is being strained by a lack of development. We have a growing population, but a lack of development. Russia is a key part of the Russia-India-China Partnership for Asia. Why not think of a constructive, mutually beneficial division of labor rather than competition? The LaRouche movement is worth acknowledging for a few reasons. First, because as a tendency with Marxist roots, it broke with the left, seeing their alliance with the Eastern establishment and degrowth as incorrect. Secondly, despite breaking with Marxism, it held on to an essential part of the Marxist ideology, which is a focus on historical progress, aiming to advance technology and create greater abundance. The LaRouche movement correctly identified the division in the ruling class that would become key as being growth versus degrowth. LaRouche's early textbook, Dialectical Economics, published under the pseudonym Lynn Marcus, got the essence of fascism as being rooted in an attempt to destroy the productive forces and reduce consumption, something that had earlier been stated by British communist leader R. Palm Dutt in his book, Fascism and Social Revolution. In a way, the LaRouche movement was a bit ahead of its time. as this division was not so clear in the 1980s and 90s in the absence of a full-on economic crisis. The LaRouche movement is respected in Beijing and in Moscow, with Schiller Institute members giving analysis frequently in Chinese state media. The LaRouche movement's activities in the United States at this time seem to line up pretty consistently with those of anti-imperialists, supporting Julian Assange, opposing hostility to China and Russia, though this was not always the case during the Cold War, with anti-Soviet and anti-communist rhetoric frequently appearing in LaRouche publications. The LaRouche organization has always been rather mild in its defense. The LaRouche organization has been rather mild in its defense of the Uhuru movement in response to their indictment. The LaRouche movement has its flaws, and in addition to the overall trends LaRouche correctly and brilliantly observed, there is a level of paranoia and anti-communism that accompanies the organization's activities. Regardless, understanding the divisions in the U.S. ruling class and the basis for why the left has gone astray into wokeness cannot be done without acknowledging the contributions and analysis of the LaRouche movement and their unique role in U.S. and global politics. The next section is called The Computer Revolution. After Carter was defeated by Reagan in the 1980 presidential election and the Eastern establishment retreated to some degree as the late Cold War normal set in, a process was happening behind the scenes that would have dramatic long-term implications. As he began rising in U.S. strategic circles during the political crisis of the early Nixon years, Brzezinski composed a book called Between Two Ages, America Enters the Technotronic Era. Quote, "The United States is the principal global disseminator of the technotronic revolution," Brzezinski wrote. The book argued that the upsurge of protests and rebellions in Western countries at the time was not a potential Marxist revolution, but rather a renegotiation of societal norms and the way society was structured due to changes in information technology. Brzezinski argued that by positioning itself at the center of the revolution in information technology, the world could be Americanized and communism could be defeated. It appears that Brzezinski's words were taken to heart as the U.S. intelligence apparatus began covertly working to make the United States the center of the computer revolution. In the name of beating the Soviet Union, the U.S. intelligence apparatus arranged for funding for the development of computers by private corporations. This is now an open secret. Roberto J. Gonzalez, professor of anthropology at San Jose State University, writes, "The interconnections between the world of technology networks and defense stretch back more than 50 years. For example, from the early 1960s, the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency played a crucial role in funding computer research that led to ARPANET, the precursor of today's internet. Silicon Valley's early development was financed largely by defense and intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon was heavily invested in tech companies throughout the Cold War. The market would never have produced the computer revolution, despite libertarian fantasies and the widely heralded self-congratulations of Western leaders that followed the fall of the USSR. The same forces that brought us the new left, the Eastern establishment, arranged for the computer revolution. MK Ultra drug guru Dr. Timothy Leary toured the United States after serving his prison sentence, giving speeches not only promoting hallucinogens, but also highlighting computers as the road to freedom. Leary said, "In the 20th century, whoever controls the screen controls consciousness, information, and thought. The screen is a mirror of your mind. Get it? If you are passively watching screens, you're getting programmed. If you're editing your own screen, you're in control of your mind. George Orwell had it wrong. He was too optimistic. He wrote in 1984 that Big Brother would watch us from the screens on the walls of the living rooms or bedrooms. But that is nothing. You could always duck out of sight. The current horror is that Americans voluntarily stick their amboid faces toward the screen 6 or 7 hours a day and suck up information that Big Brother is putting there. Here is the key to our future. We can control our own screens. We are designing software that will empower you to produce and direct your own mind movies, your own primetime shows." 1960s counterculture radical Jerry Rubin broke with Marxism entirely and declared himself to be a yuppie. During the early 80s, he began touring the country, having a debate with his old comrade Abby Hoffman called Yuppie versus Yippie. Rubin said that the greatest achievement of the baby boomer generation was defeating the World War II mentality. During the debate, Rubin emphasized the importance of computer technology and discussed how Eastern mysticism and other hippie meditation practices were very popular among Silicon Valley. Al Gore was widely mocked for saying, "I invented the internet. I invented the internet. Tipper and I." During the 2000 election, the full quotation was, quote, "I've traveled to every part of this country during the last 6 years. During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet. I took the initiative in moving forward a whole range of initiatives that have proven to be important to our country's economic growth and environmental protection, improvements in our educational system." What Gore was referring to was that he and the liberal Eastern establishment wing of American intelligence had pushed computer technology and information technology development for geostrategic reasons. An article from The Register, composed by Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn, two individuals described as, quote, "fathers of the internet" for their work in the tech field, emphasized how much the Democratic politician had worked to promote their goals. As far back as the 1970s, Congressman Gore promoted the idea of high-speed telecommunications as an engine for both economic growth and improvement of the education system. He was the first elected official to grasp the potential of computer communications to have a broader impact than just improving the conduct of science and scholarship. The internet as we know it today was not employed until 1983. When the internet was still in the early stages of deployment, Congressman Gore provided intellectual leadership by creating the vision of the potential benefits of high-speed computing and communication. The comment gets even more interesting when one looks into who his personal spiritual advisor was. Marilyn Ferguson, the occultist mystic who claimed to have psychic powers, served as Gore's personal medium and spiritual advisor. Marilyn Ferguson also had many meetings with Bill and Hillary Clinton at the White House, speaking to closed sessions to large groups of elite friends of the Clinton administration about her mystical and spiritual beliefs. Ferguson's 1981 book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, described a global awakening that would, quote, "bring the world back into balance." Ferguson spoke of how America is free, but California is freer. Her book highlighted the Stanford Research Institute, a well-known intelligence hub, as ground zero for the global revolutionary movement she was creating to awaken human beings, reduce consumption, and bring the world back into balance. At the same time that the United States was pouring huge amounts of money covertly into funding computer technology, it was working to lock the Soviet Union and its allies out of these advances. The Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls became a rigidly enforced treaty among NATO countries to lock socialist countries out of technological breakthroughs. The New York Times described the agreement as organized to ensure the strategic technology such as computers, machine tools, and microelectronics items that could be used for weapons and other military applications did not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did have its own computer program and even developed its own home computer system, Electronica BK0010, in 1985. The United States was able to lure many of the smartest minds in technology away from the Soviet Union with brain drain, offering them rewards and perks that the Soviet system could not. Without the budget to pursue computers in the same way and being locked out of the advances that happened in the West, the USSR got left behind in the computer revolution. The lower levels of capital always feared the Eastern establishment's computer revolution project to some degree. Patriotic Reagan-era movies depict conservatives and military heroes as strong, attractive athletes, while the computer revolution is the territory of socially awkward and perhaps mentally ill nerds. As the internet emerged in the 90s, the religious right highlighted how it expanded access to pornography and threatened American families. Marx saw that capitalism had a built-in problem called overproduction. The more wealth that was produced and the more efficient production became, the greater economic stability and poverty resulted. William Z. Foster explained, naturally, a worker getting a wage of $3 to $5 a day cannot buy back the 10 to 20 or more dollars worth of commodities he has produced. This gap between his producing and buying powers widens by the constant increase in workers' productive capacity through machinery and speed up, and also by the lowering of their living standards. The capitalists waste a huge amount of the masses of these stolen commodities through luxurious living, by the creation of hordes of parasitic occupations, by immense military establishments and wars. They seek to dispose of them by export trade, but the surpluses are not exhausted by these means. There is an inevitable tendency to glut the market with unsaleable commodities, even though, as now, the millions of producers who make up the bulk of the population may actually starve and die for want of the barest necessities of life. The market suffers from overproduction. Marx coupled this with an understanding called the tendency of the falling rate of profit, showing that only human labor power creates value, and that reducing the role of workers in production, replacing them with machines, leads to less value being created and smaller profits for the capitalists over time. Nelson Peary explained it this way: what does robotics demand? The robots demand that their production be given away because there is no value to their production. What makes revolution absolutely inevitable is that we have a society based on the creation of value and production that is increasingly valueless. What is value? Value is the exchange relationship between things. This cup is worth so many tape recorders, or this pair of shoes is worth so many marbles. It is the relationship between things. Thus, if one robot is producing cups and another robot is producing tape recorders, how do you equate them? If a human makes a cup and a human being makes a tape recorder, you can equate their relationship by how much labor time went into making the cup and how much labor time went into making the tape recorder. You can establish relatively how many cups are worth how many tape recorders. But if a robot makes them, how do you then establish a value relationship between them? I don't think you can. Robots can make cars, but they can't buy them. Since production is increasingly carried out without human labor, without creating value, such production cannot be distributed with money. Money expresses value. Expended labor time is the basis of exchange, and it is represented by money. If the worker doesn't work anymore and the robot creates the commodities, how is it possible to sell them? You cannot sell them. And if you don't sell them, how are you going to distribute them? Sam Marcy explained it this way: profit does not come from machinery itself. It is the labor power of a worker. Worker produces greater value than they receive back in wages. And it is the unpaid portion of their labor that produces surplus value. But a robot is not a worker. A robot is a fixed or constant capital, which does not produce profit. The individual capitalists are driven to substitute labor-saving machinery for workers because it gives them a competitive advantage. For a certain period of time, the capitalist who is able to utilize the new technology and lower the unit cost of his product can actually enjoy a greater profit because the market reflects a generalized cost still based on the old technology. Eventually, however, the new technology itself becomes generalized and the rate of profit falls. The advantage to a higher composition of constant capital is always temporary. Moreover, it spurs on destructive competition, in which much equipment that could be still socially useful is made prematurely obsolete. In order to compensate for the falling rate of profit, the owners are forced to increase the volume of profit. This can only be done by further increasing production. Much of the economic literature deals with the displacement of jobs as the result of the introduction of high technology, but it does not deal with the decline in the rate of profit from the long-range point of view. Technology is a double-edged weapon. Furthermore, automation does not solve the problem of the capitalist contradiction that leads to economic crisis. On the contrary, it exacerbates it precisely because of the decline in the rate of profit. It increases the productivity of labor, but decreases the proportion of labor used in production in relation to the amount of fixed capital. The greatest and deepest economic crises of capitalism tend to follow the biggest technological leaps. As the efficiency with which capitalists can produce goods increases dramatically, the resulting crisis of poverty amid plenty becomes equally dramatic. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, the US economy was also suffering. Unemployment was rising and living standards were decreasing. Fred Goldstein wrote about how the first jobless recovery took place in the early 90s. As the recession of 1990 and 1991, US capitalism entered the era of jobless recoveries. For the first time, employment either continued to decline or remained flat along the economy long after the economy began to recover. Jobs were either being lost or remained flat for 18 months after the start of the economic upturn. Prior to that time, there had been a typical lag of 1 quarter or 3 months before the start of economic expansion and job recovery. The divergence between economic growth and joblessness caused concern among bourgeois economists for a while. However, after the 1990-1991 recession came the collapse of the USSR and Eastern Europe. There followed a surge of investment abroad, a technology boom at home, and the longest period of economic expansion in U.S. history. The economists promptly forgot about the jobless recovery of 1991 to 92. They declared the arrival of a new economy and the end of history, speculating about the end of the business cycle. The U.S. economy then stabilized due to the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the wave of foreign investment and expansion into China, and in the 90s, is remembered as a period of prosperity. However, at the end of the decade saw the crash on the Asian markets, which had a dramatic global impact. U.S. money was pulled out of South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and many parts of Asia. As George W. Bush assumed the presidency, the U.S. economy was suffering. Bush famously told the U.S. public that if they wanted to help the country after the September 11th attack, they should, quote, go shopping. Goldstein explained, the hopes were that after 75 years of being constrained by socialist revolution and national liberation struggles, the collapse of the material center of the socialist camp would somehow allow infinite expansion and enable the capitalists to overcome the inner contradictions of their system. But, as Marx wrote, the real barrier of capitalist production is capital itself. The hopes of the bourgeoisie came crashing down in 2000 with the collapse of the technology bubble and the loss of jobs, along with $5 trillion in paper wealth. The vast expansion of capital to every corner of the globe could not eradicate the contradictions inherent in the profit system. It took a speculative boom in technology with hundreds of companies being created every week to pump up the economy, even with the overseas expansion. The capitalist downturn followed the boom, just as it had since 1825, when the first global downturn took place. More important than the downturn itself was the nature of the second jobless recovery that followed. It turned out that the jobless recovery of 1991 to 1992 had not been an anomaly, but an ominous harbinger of things to come. During the first 27 months of the next recovery, from November 2001 to March 2004, there was a net loss of 594,000 jobs. It took more than 5 years for the job level to reach the point at which it had been before the downturn began. According to Stephen Roach, the chief economist of Morgan Stanley at the time, job growth by 2004 was 8 million less than growth in a normal recovery. At the same time, all kinds of deregulation of lending were taking place under the advisement of U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan. The U.S. public was simply not buying houses, purchasing products, and consuming as they once had. The spending power of the American working class had decreased due to the elimination of good-paying industrial jobs, the reduction of the public sector, and many other factors. Americans couldn't keep spending as they once had, but the economy needed it. The explosion of debt in the early years of the 21st century was an attempt to keep the spending going, but it only worked for a little while. As Fred Goldstein explained, in the struggle to maximize profits, the capitalist class has always relied on new technology that drives workers to produce more and more in less and less time at lower and lower wages. Every capitalist is compelled to use technology as a matter of survival. It is a law of capitalism. This creates a huge contradiction, which gets worse and worse as capital grows. Under the capitalist system, no matter how wide the scope of its operation, production is driven forward by leaps and bounds under the impact of competition for profits. The bosses look for new, more productive technology and economies of scale to cut the labor costs, and this leads to ever expanding production, which outpaces the slow development of consumer power of society. The dramatic events of 2008, 2009, when the housing bubble burst, marked not only the end of a certain level of prosperity for the US public, but also the end of what is known as the late Cold War normal in American politics. The neoconservatives were out of power because they had botched the job. The Bush administration's policies after the 9/11 attacks had significantly weakened US imperialism on the global stage. After 9/11, Bush had declared that 3 countries, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, were the axis of evil. This had been in line with the neoconservatives and their vision for conducting regime change in a number of countries, as laid out in their document, Project for a New American Century. However, Brzezinski strongly objected to the Bush administration's moves. According to Brzezinski's biography, Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Grand Strategist, by Justin Vasse, in Brzezinski's eyes, Bush's Monarchian approach was precisely the one that had to be avoided. This was because it masked the real political stakes by substituting morality for strategic reality, and because it made it harder for America's allies to go along. The result of Bush's policies in the short term seemed to benefit U.S. imperialism. Iraq, a stronghold of anti-imperialism in the region, was destroyed. Oil prices rose to the highest levels in history, over $120 per barrel, as a major oil-producing country that exported in competition with the United States was removed from the market. However, in the long term, the results of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the war on terror strengthened the anti-imperialist camp. The sharp rise in oil prices after the U.S. invasion of Iraq enabled Russian President Vladimir Putin to speed ahead with his project of rebooting his country's economy with state control of oil and gas. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela also utilized the oil profits to fund his project of spreading socialism and anti-imperialism across Latin America. The hardliner faction of the Islamic Republic of Iran also got a boost. Bush referred to the war on terror as a crusade, alienating Muslims from potentially collaborating with the United States. The Muslim Brotherhood, a longtime ally of the United States, distanced itself from America as increasingly anti-Islamic tones came from Bush and his religious allies. Al Jazeera, a TV network funded by Qatar and sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, put forward anti-US sentiments in the Muslim world. France and Germany had loudly opposed the US invasion of Iraq, and disunity within the NATO coalition enabled the recently emboldened Russia to make new business agreements. Russia began selling oil and gas to Europe at a much higher rate. With Bolivarian socialism rising in South America, Israel's 2006 invasion of Lebanon resulted in a humiliating defeat for Israel. Hezbollah, an anti-imperialist Islamic movement tied to Iran, became the heroes of the entire Muslim world for how effectively it repelled the Israeli invasion. Hurricane Katrina and the bungled response of the Bush administration opened the floodgates of rage and opposition to the U.S. government from the Black community. The Millions More March, led by the Nation of Islam in 2005, in the direct aftermath of Katrina, featured video messages from Cuban government officials, praise for Iran and China, and a call for the Black community to align with the anti-imperialist camp. With the world slipping out of U.S. domination and unrest potentially breaking out at home, the neoconservative strategies had to be chucked. The Eastern establishment was back, with a student of Brzezinski's foreign policy school suddenly becoming the darling of mainstream media. Barack Obama took office in the direct aftermath of the financial crash, with Brzezinski directly advising him. Obama had studied at Columbia University International Studies Department run by Brzezinski, and Obama was very much a product of the Eastern establishment, geostrategic, managerial wing of American politics. According to America's grand strategist, until the election of Barack Obama, Brzezinski assailed the ideas of neoconservatives and their Manichaean concept of the war on terror that had created a climate of irrational fear and Islamophobia within the population, and had at the same time given leaders in Russia, in Israel, an unhoped for tool for dressing up their own repressive policies. When Obama was attacked for having someone on staff who had praised Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer's book, The Israel Lobby, Obama and Brzezinski met directly to discuss the matter. Brzezinski described how much he liked Obama, saying, quote, "I was immensely impressed by him. After Kennedy, this is the most politically and intellectually impressive would-be candidate for president." The rise of Barack Obama marked the seizure of power by the Eastern establishment. In response to the economic crisis and the rising anti-imperialist bloc around the world, they sought to swiftly implement degrowth policies. They want to lock down the Western countries and the world and roll back the wheels of history in the hopes of securing their position at the top. The managerial bourgeoisie is battling against both lower levels of capital at home and the anti-imperialist countries around the world, both of whom reject their vision of a high-tech dark age, a tightly controlled capitalism to contain and gradually eliminate humanity. Obama faced a wave of opposition as he took office from the lower levels of capital, primarily fracking companies, who saw big oil as their main competitors and were riding a wave of profits from Bush's high oil prices. However, Obama and the Eastern establishment had a new weapon in their arsenal to use against the insurgent lower levels of capital: social media. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms, rolled out in coordination with the intelligence agencies, shifted the discourse very much in Obama's favor and against the right wing that opposed him. Within the Obama administration, Jared Andrew Cohen, formerly a member of the board of Google Alphabet, functioned as the liaison between the State Department and the tech monopolies. An article from The New Yorker, published in April of 2011, described how Jared Andrew Cohen went to Twitter and advised them to take actions to destabilize Iran without Obama's permission, and how he, quote, almost lost his job over it. If it had been up to the White House, they would have fired him. The article goes on to say that Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, protected him. Quote, Clinton did not betray any disagreement with President Obama over the Iran policy, but an interview in an interview with me, she cited Cohen's action with pride. The Arab Spring seems to have been an event that largely was engineered in order to help Americanize the world and get ahead of any spontaneous unrest that may have resulted from the economic crisis. With social media and assistance from Al Jazeera, which shifted to a pro-American tone in the age of Obama, various, quote, revolutions were pushed and enabled to happen in ways that benefited the U.S. ruling class. Socialism was overthrown in Libya. Syria faced a horrendous civil war that created millions of refugees and spawned the horrific terrorist organization known as ISIS. Trump's presidency, however, seemed to represent resistance to the Obama administration and its strategies from the lower levels of capital. Instead of staffing his administration with academics from Eastern establishment think tanks and institutes, Trump staffed his administration with lower-level capitalists, millionaires and billionaires who are not part of the club. Betsy DeVos, the heiress of the Amway fortune, became Secretary of Education. Eric Prince of Blackwater Academy became a prominent figure within the Trump movement, as did Peter Thiel of PayPal. Elon Musk is part of the Trump universe, and his assumption of control of Twitter involved many revelations of how the FBI had coordinated with social media to manipulate discourse and suppress Trump and his allies. The lower levels of capital are furious with the Eastern establishment for a very obvious reason. They want to make more money. The Eastern establishment is focused on degrowth, reducing consumption, reducing the population, and rolling back the wheels of history in order to stay on top. The lower levels of capital want more profits and find policies intended to stabilize and gradually reduce economic output to be infuriating. However, another factor must be taken into account: the rising alternative economy. China was once the impoverished sick man of Asia, but under the leadership of the Communist Party, it has become an industrial powerhouse and the second largest economy on earth. With socialism, the USSR industrialized and became a superpower, and Putin rescued the country from Western looting that followed the fall of the USSR in the 90s. Bolivarian socialism, Baathism, the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the Houthi movement in Yemen, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the BRICS are all focused on creating economic growth. The global axis of resistance is opposing the system that Lenin called capitalism in its monopoly stage, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. This is a system where economic development is halted across the planet, and the world is forced to stay poor and get poorer so wealthy financial institutions based in Western countries can enrich themselves and stay at the top. In the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, this end was achieved mainly with economic neoliberalism. The World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund forced countries to privatize their natural resources, deregulate foreign trade, and have their economies crushed by Western monopolies through deregulation, laissez-faire approach. NAFTA destroyed the agricultural sectors of Mexico and Haiti. Oil-rich African countries like Nigeria remained impoverished as Western supermajors were given an unlimited access, almost unlimited access with nothing going back into the domestic economy. Since the 2008 financial crisis and the rise of the BRICS, the strategies of the Western imperialist monopolies have shifted, but the goal remains the same. Instead of privatizations and deregulation justified with the belief that the free market magically creates growth, the looting and forced impoverishment of the developing world is coming in the form of environmental decrees, forbidding the construction of new power plants, restrictions on living conditions, COVID lockdowns, and other measures that restrict development. As Barack Obama put it when speaking to a group of African students, quote, "Ultimately, if you think about all the youth that everyone has mentioned here in Africa, if everybody is raising living standards to the point where everyone has got a car and everyone's got air conditioning and everyone's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over." Imperialism is degrowth. Iraq had broken free of Western domination and, with control of its oil resources, had begun to develop. Libya had done the same. American cruise missiles and bombs cast both countries into a state of chaos and impoverishment once again. The anti-imperialist countries of the world are all striving for growth. The working class, suffering from lower living standards amid a high-tech economy that has less and less of a place for them, is also striving for growth. The lower levels of capital are also striving for growth. This creates a situation for a new realignment to defeat imperialism. Let us recall that after the Second World War, the stated goal of the Communist Party of the United States was the creation of an anti-monopoly coalition that aligned with the Soviet Union against the war makers and imperialists. William Z. Foster described it this way, quote, "In order for the people to put the United States firmly on the path toward peace, democracy, and general well-being, the power of the monopolists who dominate our country must be curbed and finally broken. The way our party foresees the possible development for the future is along the following general lines. First, we propose the regular election of a democratic coalition government based on a broad united front combination of workers, small farmers, Negroes, professionals, small business groups, and other democratic elements who are ready to fight against monopoly, economic breakdown, fascism, and war." William Z. Foster's orientation remains more or less correct. The ultra-rich monopolists who are seeking to maintain the global order with degrowth amid a long-term crisis of overproduction can be overcome by the creation of a united front. Much like in the oppressed countries where the working class sits at the center of a revolutionary movement for the rejuvenation of the entire nation, conditions have gotten to the point that such a coalition is possible in the imperialist homelands as well. Just as Mao's bloc of four great classes drove out the imperialists and pushed China onto the course of development, the United States could undergo a similar development. The lower levels of capital, the working class, those aligned with the anti-imperialist countries, those who want economic growth and reject the emerging low-wage police state, can be unified to bring to power a government that battles the big monopolies and brings society into motion. There are a few factors that prevent this from happening. First, that is that the socialist politics in the West have become completely subordinated to protecting the deep state from Trump and from the lower levels of capital. Most socialist groups do not support existing Marxist-Leninist governments, and among those who do, those who understand their foreign policy and stand with Russia, Iran, and Venezuela and other Marxist-Leninist anti-imperialist states are a very small minority. Much of the so-called left has decided that existing socialist countries are fascist, and furthermore echo that Donald Trump is supposedly a fascist for supporting Russia and North Korea. The socialist left has completely been commandeered into being foot soldiers of the Eastern establishment, the most dangerous wing of U.S. capitalism. Many socialists are now claiming degrowth is somehow compatible with Marx's vision of a stateless, classless world based on vast abundance. Any forces that seek to build a real anti-monopoly coalition in the United States as a road to defeating imperialism must break with the left, as such ideas are unwelcome in leftist circles. The left focuses on LGBT and identity politics, and a vicious cancel culture is unleashed on anyone who would dare assert anything close to the agenda of William Z. Foster or the Communist Party. The synthetic left, or woke forces that operate as the foot soldiers of the Eastern establishment, are an outgrowth of CIA manipulation of leftist politics. They emerged in three distinct phases. One, they emerged first with the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program, Project MKUltra, and various foundations funded to promote left-wing activism during the 1960s. During this period, they were an intentional manipulation meant to supplant and prevent the rise of a genuine communist movement in the West. Two, during the late 70s and 80s, these forces were dispatched to the communist and anti-imperialist countries of the world. They ideologically contaminated the ruling parties with anti-Stalinism and, quote, democratic socialism and a kind of classless striving for universal human values. They courted factions within anti-imperialist governments to become liquidators like Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They polluted the culture of anti-imperialist countries, bringing in cultural hedonism, pornography, drugs, and other cultural factors to demoralize the youth. They set the stage for color revolutions that enabled Western imperialism to reconquer countries. They did what hardline right-wingers could never do. With their leftist approach, they were able to sneak in and subvert anti-imperialist and socialist countries internally. 3, in response to the 2008 financial crisis, these forces have been brought back to the United States. The color revolution apparatus has come home to function as the enforcers of the Eastern establishment in its desire to lock down and degrow the United States. The FBI and CIA work with them in their efforts to suppress sections of the U.S. state and layers of the population that will not accept the sinister visions dreamed up by the Rockefeller think tanks. The tech monopolies back them up. We must understand that what this synthetic left or woke current is, and we must not confuse it with genuine anti-imperialism or socialism. The only thing this current takes from Marxism is the dialectical philosophy, the aesthetic of rebellion, and the spiritual roots of Marxism from the French Revolution. They do not support existing communist governments. They do not promote Marxist economics, and they do not seek to empower the broad masses of the working class. The synthetic left are not comrades who have gone astray. They are the main danger. The synthetic left, out of the movement to the masses, means cutting ties with them, going to recruit those who seek to resist the low-wage police state that they are working to impose. Another factor that makes the needed pro-humanity, pro-growth coalition difficult to build is that the lower levels of capital continue to propagate the idea that deregulation and free markets are the solution. Like the Birchers of the 1960s, they confusedly think the Eastern establishment are communists. They envision that if total deregulation is implemented, the problems facing society arising from the market will simply vanish. They live in a world of Cold War anti-communist ignorance, where communists think everyone should be poor and believe money is bad and want to make everyone equal. However, during the Trump administration, it became clear that he couldn't simply deregulate. On multiple occasions, Trump used the state and its resources to protect his supporters. As the crisis intensifies, the lower levels of capital will start to realize that deregulating won't help them. Rather than getting the government out of the way, they'll more and more want a government that punches in the same direction, striking against their enemies, the way Biden's state is currently striking against them. The process of Bonapartism involves the state centralizing in the hands of a few capitalists who utilize it to suppress rivals within their own camp. While the Eastern establishment is the primary Bonapartist faction, calls for Bonapartism from the other direction will materialize soon enough. It will be difficult because anti-communism and worship of capitalism have been central to American right-wing politics for so long. The admiration for Vladimir Putin and the kind of conversations being had by Tucker Carlson are the beginning of a trend that will take a significant amount of time to play out. Old ways of thinking are gradually unlearned with new conditions. We cannot forget, however, that during the Great Depression, other than the obscure Austrian school academics, every faction of the ruling class was aligned with, quote, socialists of some variety. The Communist Party had no monopoly on socialism, as Social Democrats and fascists both condemned capitalism and called for state control to improve working conditions. They differed in who their enemies and targets were and who they offered to empower. Fascist socialism involved degrowth measures. Social democracy involved welfare state reforms, and only communists offered a change in property relations. In the Third World, libertarian rhetoric is largely non-existent, and every faction is offering promises of some brand of socialism or other. It is also important to point out that socialism has changed since the Soviet years. 21st century socialism involves a vast market sector promoted by the state. Deng Xiaoping economic reforms are the model that Vietnam followed, and Cuba and People's Korea are striving to be more like this. Deng's economic policies were also a big influence on Putin's reinvention of the Russian economy. Bolivarian socialism in Nicaragua and elsewhere has utilized micro-entrepreneurship programs and independent cooperatives. 21st century socialism is not hostile to lower-level capitalists, but sees them as part of the equation of maintaining a rationally planned economy to ensure long-term growth and move toward the ultimate goal of a world free from scarcity. The calls for a government of action that would take swift action to control natural resources, build infrastructure, strategically control the lending of money in order to stimulate growth, cancel debt, and enact an economic Bill of Rights is a vision that would embolden the lower levels of capital and allow them to function in the context of a more prosperous economy. It would empower them by weakening and destroying the big monopolies. As the crisis intensifies, the lower levels of capital will realize that such a government of action is needed to prevent their total destruction at the hands of the ultra-rich. The process of building the needed anti-monopoly coalition will be very difficult. It will not be a quick solution. Building this coalition is not a matter of going viral on social media or becoming a popular commentator on current affairs. Building this coalition will mean creating a network of people who can operate in coordination with each other to carry out real operations to achieve short-term goals. Building this coalition will mean testing people, training people, making mistakes and learning from them, gradually solidifying an apparatus that can be more and more effective as the crisis intensifies. In Mao Zedong's theory of people's war, there is a concept called strategic equilibrium. This refers to the moment when the countryside is securely under the grip of the revolutionary forces, and the remaining task is to seize the urban centers. In the moment of strategic equilibrium, the tactics of the Revolutionary Army completely change, as the battlefield has completely changed. A new balance of power necessitates new tactics, new alliances, and a complete change in operations. In the revolutionary process of the United States, moving toward an anti-monopoly government, there will be a moment of strategic equilibrium. It will be a moment in which the level of desperation on the part of the population becomes much more intense very quickly, and the divisions in the ruling class take on a much more violent and overt character. In such a moment, a network of people who can cooperate and rely on each other to carry out effective operations will be vital. And the various distractions of social media and fandoms will be rendered pretty much irrelevant. Working to construct the anti-monopoly, pro-humanity, pro-growth coalition must be done with this in mind. There will be a moment when millions of Americans are hungry and desperate to eat and have security in their existence. There will be a moment when factions in the ruling class begin to violently suppress each other, and sections of the currently existing U.S. state are actively fighting each other with weapons. We do not seek to create this crisis, and it will happen regardless of our intervention. Our strategy must focus on having our apparatus in place for when the crisis does arise, so we can maneuver effectively within it, maintain vital alliances in which we are useful allies, and provide the services and organizational apparatus necessary to bring a layer of thousands of people into our milieu. The challenge of the moment is to build our own organization and plant the seeds of the needed coalition with the moment of strategic equilibrium in mind. Many who knew Vladimir Lenin recalled interacting with him personally and remembered an anecdote written by Leo Tolstoy. He often told his followers to explain the activities of the Bolshevik Party in the lead up to taking power. Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, recalled it this way. He was going along and he saw from afar a man squatting and waving his arms about in a ridiculous way. A madman, he thought. But when he drew nearer, he saw it to be a man sharpening a knife on the curb. The same thing happens in theoretical disputes. From the outside, it seems a sheer waste of time. But when you go into the matter more deeply, you see that it is a momentous issue. We should expect the coming period to be one of confusion, realignments, betrayals, splits, and all kinds of different twists and turns. But this is all preparation for the moment when a solid organization will be the vital factor in changing society and nothing else will matter. And that's the book, Divisions in the Ruling Class.